Welcome back to Just FYI Pod Ideas. It is Thursday, January the 16th. It's about 10 a.m. I'm on the phone here with Clark Elliston. How's it going, Clark?
I'm living my best life now, man. I'm in full-on monk mode. I'm in my outdoor office that is unventilated, and this morning it was 22 degrees in Kerrville,
Wow,
Texas. Yeah.
that's cold.
And so I'm sitting here, I'm almost shivering. I'm allowing our conversation to warm me up, man. So it's cold, but I'm in my special place talking about Plato, which makes me feel fantastic. It makes me feel like a real philosophy student, which I don't know if you should glory in being a philosophy student, but nonetheless, I'm feeling great. How are you?
It's like being in Philosophy 101 again.
It is, and it also has echoes of Oxford. I mean, let's not lie. We did a lot of work in a basement that was poorly ventilated. And in England in the winter, there's not much to do outside, so you're kind of low. You're cold. You've got a coat on, and I don't have a coat on. I've got a flannel, and that feels suitably Texan philosophy for me anyway. So, no, yeah,
Kierkegaard would
no,
say you're engaging in recollections. You're
mm,
bringing back the
mm,
memories of huddling in the Regent's Park basement in Oxford. I like it.
yep,
It's good. It's a good mental
yeah.
space to be in. Do you have like a heater in there? Like you said,
I
did you
do.
say that?
I
Yeah.
do. I have a little space heater, and I have a window unit to bring in some outside air in the summer. But if you know anything about Texas summers, that doesn't do that much. And the heater normally really keeps up, but obviously not with like 25-degree weather. And I would also
Let
say
me,
too, yeah,
yeah. Let me give you a piece of advice though.
yeah.
Maybe a couple days before Christmas, I had to run my daughter over to Target to pick up something. And I saw these electric blankets sitting out, different colors and varieties of
Yeah,
electric
man.
blankets. I had one when I was a kid. I thought those had gone out of style, or maybe they're like
Oh
dangerous, or they have
no.
fire hazard or something. I don't know, but I looked at it and I thought my wife would really like one of these.
Yes, you did.
And dude, this is the best present I've ever given her. I could give her diamond rings. It wouldn't matter compared to the Brookstone. This is not, by the way, a sponsorship, but it would
It
not
could
matter.
be. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it should. Brookstone, reach out to us, okay? But but she just loves it.
Can,
But
can I can I raise you
yeah.
and just say my son Caleb, my oldest, is we got him an electric blanket, but guess what? It's weighted. So like
Oh,
if for people that
oh,
like that
yes.
sensory experience of having something like heavy, it's like heavy and warm. Now let me tell you, I can be a little overweight at times, and so that's my constant existence. It's a little heavy and a little warm. So an electric weighted blanket is maybe not be my number one gift, but he loves it. And in fact, to
So,
punish him,
have
I
you
took it I
tried
took it
weighted?
away from him.
Yeah. So you like the weighted blanket thing? Like you're into that?
I must admit, it feels kind of nice. It's not one of those things that if you ask me, outside the pod, like, and before my family had one, like, oh, is it cool? I'd be like, I mean, I don't know, meh. And in reality, it's pretty nice. It's pretty nice.
Okay. Years ago, I don't remember how we came into the possession of a weighted blanket. I don't know, but none of us liked it. I don't. It must be
What?
something. Yeah, it's like anathema in the family. I don't think it made the move. It was boxed up in Philly, and it never came to Alabama.
Okay, well, I
So
know we're
I don't
supposed to
know
keep
where
this
the weight.
short, but I do have a question for you then. Are you guys wild
Yeah,
sleepers? Like, are you real movers or are you pretty like mummy sleepers?
I don't know. Again, we tried the weighted blanket on everybody. The kids would be like, "No, this thing's terrible. I feel like something's crushing me." Maybe there's a claustrophobia in the family. I don't know, but
Well, let me just
nobody
tell
really
you,
gravitated to. Yeah,
we are mummy
no pun
sleepers.
intended.
No, no, yeah, I got you.
Right, right.
We're mummy sleepers, and so like the more still you are, probably the better you sleep. And so I think in that context, a weighted blanket's like it feels that constraining thing. It's like, ooh, great, can't move now. Need to be totally mummified for this rest period or something. And it's just great. I like sleeping in sleeping bags. And throughout college, I slept in a sleeping bag. Can you believe that? I
Are
didn't
you
want to.
serious?
Yeah,
On
man, I
top of
didn't.
a bed?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, sorry. I had a bed and I had like a top sheet just to appease my mother. And then I slept in a sleeping bag and I just washed it regularly. And that way I didn't have to fool around with bedding and I like the compression of a sleeping bag. And so everyone thought it was weird, but I was like, this is just efficient. Like I don't have to mess around with like sheets getting untucked and, you know, tangling up my legs. No, I never got tangled because I was in my mummy bag. So
You're like a desert monk sleeping in your coffin, basically.
Guilty
This
as
is.
charged.
Oh, Clark, you get more interesting every year. We've gone tilapia farming, weighted blankets, sleeping in sleeping bags on top of the bed.
Well,
I don't know where this is going.
it's just coming out, Chris. That's all it is. It's always been
Yeah.
there, man. It's just been latent. It's just been latent.
Well, all right. So I really need to stop laughing. Today we're going to talk about Plato, as you alluded to earlier, and this is going to be a companion episode to earlier this year, this season, when we discussed Nietzsche together on a single pod. Today, I'm going to talk about Plato's famous text, The Republic, which, of course, is arguably the most important philosophical work ever written, and therefore, inevitably, I will not be able to get into every facet of that book, but it's an important book and I think one well worth covering. And then you are going to focus on, what did you decide?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about Plato's Timaeus, which is a work from his later oeuvre, and really, I should say too, in a subsidiary way to the Republic, because I would say
Mhm.
we need to spend the vast majority of our time on the Republic, but the Timaeus is a nice, I think, companion piece, not least because the Timaeus actually begins with a rehashing of the Republic. So there's a nice kind of parallel there that we'll talk about briefly. So no, I'll be talking about the Timaeus.
A good segue. And then Timaeus, of course, famously offers a creation account, which I think in many respects parallels with Christian theology. So lots to cover in this episode on the great philosopher Plato. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a break, come back, no more weighted blankets today
Mm.
anyway, and we're going to dive into Plato. Okay, we're back here to discuss the great Greek philosopher Plato. And Clark, you mentioned earlier that reading and discussing Plato today reminds you of being at Oxford, but I'm assuming you had read Plato prior to coming to Oxford, right?
Yeah, I had, and
Yeah.
and I've said in prior podcasts, like I've always been kind of fascinated by philosophy, and always wondered like where did it begin? If I was going to educate myself in philosophy, it made sense to go back to the beginning. And I really think there is no beginning other than Plato. Just
Mhm.
because, like if you really, really geek out, you can go to the pre-Socratics and study them. But like, I,
Sure.
I, I don't think that is at that point, the utility of studying ancient Greek philosophy, I think starts to diminish. And so really for Mac's benefit, and I just want to let the people in on the weirdness of our relationship, Chris. We spent a good deal of time like in the weight room at Oxford and at various eating establishments discussing how would we fashion the cyborg if we were to create a
Right.
a, a composite theological student. How would we educate them? And
This was our guardian, our version of Plato's
yes,
guardians,
that's
right?
right. And
Yeah.
and ultimately, if I recall correctly, I mean, Plato is absolutely integral to that education. As is
I
Aristotle.
mean,
So I think this it shows to some extent how the regard with which I hold Plato, or rather in which I hold Plato, as well as Aristotle, probably more than any other certainly more than any other ancient philosopher.
to be clear, our cyborg, which we would put in scare quotes, was not some kind of AI generated robot like they were featuring
Correct.
in
Yeah,
Las Vegas last week. But
that's true.
we
That's
were
true.
we were. Did you see those, by the way?
No.
It's terrifying. They're
No.
they're like life size walking AI bots, and one of my friends swears they're going to be on the market in a year or two. They might already be on the market.
Well,
So
the New York Times ran an article yesterday about a woman who fell in love with ChatGPT. And I mean, like, as much as like that sounds like something out of I don't know, the New York Post or the Sun or something like that in England, no, like that's on the New York Times, and it was like it was throwing it out as like a hey, this is going to be the future. Like this is just a non-normative relationship that we need to kind of keep our eyes on. And so
yeah, already
so
predicted by the movie Her. Actually,
that's right. That's
yeah.
exactly right. And the article referenced that as well. And so now this woman would love those cyborgs because now it gives a physical instantiation of what she already experiences on ChatGPT. So fantastic. Good for her.
Yes, but the cyborg that we were discussing in those days was just like a young person who was formed from an early age to think profoundly about philosophy and theology.
Yes.
And I think you and I had both lamented our public school educations. Not that there's anything wrong with it. My wife is a public school teacher, so nobody needs to at me on that. You know,
Right.
but we did say, like, what if you had been studying philosophy and theology as a young person most of the time nowadays, unless you're in Catholic school, but even in Catholic school, the theological and philosophical education is increasingly attenuated. But
Hmm.
what if you had been studying Greek and, let's say, German as an elementary school student, and then worked your way into Plato and, let's say, Hegel by the time you were in sixth, seventh grade? How much farther along in your studies would you be? And I think, like you said, you and I both identified that a strong grounding in Plato would be essential for any thinker. And I don't think that's controversial or even particularly interesting. I think for many people, Plato is the beginning of Western philosophy and really the one philosopher that everybody has to sort of respond to. What's the old saying that all of Western thinking is a footnote to Plato?
Yeah.
And so I think you and I both acknowledged that way back when, and here we are. And my kids are not philosophical cyborgs, and I'm pretty sure yours aren't either.
That's correct. Yeah.
It's not our fault, Clark. It's because of AI and Chat GPT and TikTok, which is about to get banned, and everything else. The world is just more challenging than we wanted it to be. But we could still talk about Plato today, and we can still encounter his thinking. And so, before we dive into this great book, The Republic, let me say a little bit about him. And Clark, as always, feel free to jump in. And like you said, today we're going to spend a lot of time on the Republic, so don't hesitate to interrupt. First of all, Plato. There's a really good biography written about Plato by Robin Waterfield. So if anybody is interested to know more, and you might say, well, how do we know? Are there enough sources? Waterfield, in the opening sections, really goes into how much about Plato's life we can say with relative certainty versus how much seems obscure and maybe almost mythical in some ways. But he does a pretty interesting job of going through the sources of Plato's life and thinking. So, for those who want a more in depth look, I would recommend that book. But Plato, as I just said a minute ago, is widely considered one of the great thinkers in the Western philosophical tradition. And for that reason, many people have thought his name, Plato, is some kind of reference to his breadth or his greatness, his depth of knowledge in some ways. Plato comes from a Greek term, Platon, which means broad. And so this might have been some kind of nickname, it is supposed. But on the other hand, others say there were plenty of Platos floating around Athens in the day. And so we can call him Plato with some degree of certainty. In any case, Plato was born in Greece, probably in Athens in the first half of the 5th century before Christ. He belonged to a family of influence. He had ties to the Athenian statesman Solon, who died in 6th century BCE. And Solon's political reforms paved the way for institutional democracy in Athens. So Plato, in many respects, sort of grown up knowing about Athenian democracy. And this will come back in the Republic. Plato's older brother was Glaucon. And if you read the Republic, he's a major figure and interlocutor in the book. And Glaucon was a military hero. And he is one of Socrates' key conversants in the Republic, as I just said. So Plato's upbringing would have been aristocratic. He comes from this really prominent family. This means he would have had this upbringing as a young person in athletics, mathematics, music, poetry, and politics. And then he would have followed that with a period of mandatory military service. And so after he went through these different steps, he founded a school of philosophy in Athens around the age of 40. So, Clark, we're just a few years behind. I'm telling you, it's time. It's time to start our school.
I,
Um,
where we create cyborgs. It'll be
that's right.
fantastic.
We'll call it Cyborg U.
Oh my word. Goodness gracious.
Anyway, Plato's school was known, of course, as Academia, the Academy, named for an Attic mythological hero who had long been connected to this area of Athens where the school was located. This was a sacred place, also dedicated to the goddess Athena, who was associated with wisdom and warfare and craft making. And Plato's Academy became really the preeminent Athenian institution for a number of centuries. It trained many of Athens' most prominent thinkers, including, most famously, Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. All right, I'm going to pause real quick. You got anything to add to this, Clark?
No. Actually, although I do have one question.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, isn't there some speculation that his name Plato refers to his shoulders, that he was kind of jacked?
Well, he was athletic, so
Right.
possibly. It seems that Waterfield was like, nah, he was just named Plato. Who
Yeah.
knows? We'll just call him Plato.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So, unsurprisingly, for a man of his aristocratic upbringing and station, he was interested in politics. And there were reports of him getting into a number of political controversies later in life, particularly in the Greek city of Syracuse, which is in present day Italy, which was then ruled by this tyrannical leader, Dionysius the Elder. And apparently, he sold Plato into slavery for political purposes. Now, one of the reasons why I mention this is not so much because I want to do a deep dive into this episode, but just to say that when Plato talks about tyranny and democracy and timocracy and these different forms of government in the Republic, these are very much live issues for him. The Republic is a book bound up with Plato's life. Now, Plato passes away in 348 BCE, and he's already known again as a kind of a great figure. But what's interesting about Plato, and some of this stuff is probably familiar to our listeners, but Plato does not ever speak in his own voice in his works. What he does is he uses the voice of his teacher, Socrates, as the kind of mouthpiece for his ideas. Now, Socrates himself, of course, is a very famous thinker. He's this mysterious, polarizing philosopher who was sentenced to death in Athens in 399 BCE. There is some debate as to which works most clearly reflect Socrates' own ideas versus those which reflect Plato's mature thinking. It's complicated. And I think at times we'll probably lapse into a kind of interchangeability between the two, which frankly is probably not historically accurate, but it is what it is. I think it happens for any scholar of Plato in some respects. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead,
and it's
please.
also one of those things that I think is what I always have always found irritating about Kierkegaard himself, like with the use
Right.
of all sorts of devices in order to either cloak or magnify or whatever, however we want to describe it, his own views. It's kind of endemic to the process. If you're going to put your voice into somebody else's, in the image of someone else, well, then it's going to always raise the specter of where is the real Plato, please stand up, or Kierkegaard as well. And I think it's
or the real Socrates.
that's right. Sorry. Yeah,
Right.
that's correct.
Yeah.
And so in some ways it lends itself to these really crazy swings in interpretation where it's like, oh no, actually Socrates wasn't even that bright. Like he was just a guy who asked questions and got executed or something. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh no. Plato really doesn't originate that many ideas. He really rips it all off from Socrates. And where is the truth? Who knows? Anyway.
Right. So let's say a little bit about Socrates before we jump into the book itself. So Socrates himself was raised in a relatively affluent Athenian household. And he too, like Plato, received a kind of aristocratic education. He then fought for Athens against Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And when he came back to Athens, he was considered a military great in some respects. But he came back to a very different Athens. When Athens lost to Sparta, Socrates comes back to this city that's been a shambles in some ways. He did not like the Spartans or sympathize with the Spartans' way of life, which is, of course, very militaristic. And he didn't like the oppressive puppet government that the Spartans had set up in Athens, known as the 30 Tyrants. But at the same time, Socrates was a fierce critic of the Athenian nobility and the norms of the elite classes in Athens. And so I mean, everybody knows this, right? Socrates would go around in rough clothing. He was famously ugly. He had a great personal commitment to austerity, didn't bathe and these sorts of things. And it was, in a way, a kind of middle finger to what he considered to be the elitist depravity in Athens. He was somebody who had really decided to challenge the ethical and philosophical presuppositions of the ruling elite. And he would often try to expose the contradictions that were offered by his interlocutor. And he would usually do this by continuing to ask questions, this sort of gadfly approach to philosophy. And for this reason, Socrates was ultimately convicted of impiety and for corrupting the young. And he decided to refuse exile, which was offered to him, and instead drank poison hemlock, which ended his life, as I said earlier. Socrates himself did not write down his ideas or his teachings. So Plato becomes really the best source on Socrates' life and thinking. The other major source is the historian and philosopher Xenophon. And I've not read, I don't know if you have, Clark. Have you read
I
Xenophon's,
have not.
works? Yeah, I haven't either. I mean, I only know them through Kierkegaard's book on the concept of irony, where he does some comparative work. Xenophon's version of Socrates is somewhat different than that of Plato, but I think both of them held Socrates in high esteem. For our present purposes, the main thing to say is just that Plato does not give you an unbiased presentation of Socrates because, again, Socrates was not just somebody that he had seen around town. It was also a friend of his in some respects, a mentor, we might say. When Plato sat down to work on these different dialogues, that's what his works are often called. They're dialogues because they're written as conversations between people. Socrates appears in all but one dialogue. The one he does not appear in, by the way, is called Laws. And Socrates turns up in most of these dialogues, including in the Republic, which we're about to discuss. So Plato concludes the Republic by saying, and we'll come back to this as well, that Socratic dialectic, this mode of conversation, of pulling the truth out of people, is the ideal educational cornerstone. It's what you would want if you're going to create the ideal philosopher, and I think that's itself an interesting sort of point of discussion. So that's that's all I have by way of overview of Plato and Socrates. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about that.
Yeah, well, I would just say this. I think with regard to the final point about the ideal form of education, I think this is exactly right, actually. And I am a full-blooded, full-throated Platonist on this point because it does seem. I mean, I've told the story a million times, but the most transformative educational experience of my life was moving from an American master's program and going to Oxford and doing a tutorial. And you may giggle, Chris, with Stephen Mulhall on the work of Alistair MacIntyre, who I do love as a philosopher, and I thought I knew him really well, right up until Professor Mulhall started asking me questions.
Right, right.
And he did nothing other than stone-faced ask me questions for about 15 minutes. It didn't take long before I had no
He's
answer.
always stone faced,
That's
by the
right.
way.
That's right.
Right.
This hence the reason for my adulation. And it took no time at all before I was silent because there was nothing I could say, and I had become very skilled at kind of presenting as though I knew something when I really didn't, because it worked in one form of education. But when you're sitting in front of another person and they're simply asking you questions or asking you to defend and to articulate something, and if you don't actually know what you're talking about, then it becomes painfully obvious, painfully quickly, that is indeed the case. So from there, I learned just in leaps and bounds about what the ability to describe something from a 30,000 foot view, which is what I thought I could do. And the idea of actually understanding and articulating something in a deeper sense, the difference or the distance between those two ways of thinking about education. So I think the Socratic method of just asking questions and making people defend what it is they think and why do they think it is spot on even today. And it actually marks when we talk about education at some point in a future podcast. I think this marks actually superior education is the the space and requirement that students own and defend ideas.
No, it's true. And by way of an aside, I think it's worth noting that Clark had this fascination with Stephen Mulhall, and it was a great honor for both of us when he contributed to our collected volume, Scorsese and Religion. And of course, with characteristic brusqueness, he would just here's the essay, and we would look at it and be like, "Wow, that's really good. Does this guy ever write a false word?" Everything just flows
And
effortlessly. But I do think Clark, your intellectual heroes say something about you, right? So I've been very much influenced by George Pattison, who is my doctoral supervisor at Oxford. And George is the kind of guy that talks about Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein over pints at a pub while wearing a leather jacket. Mulhall, I don't want to say he's not cool, but he is very serious, like you said, intimidating, not necessarily intentionally so, but the kind of person that could just stare you down and make you cower in a
yes,
seminar room. Is that what you aspire to, Clark? Deep down, you want to control the room like that with just your gaze?
no. I think it's actually the other. It's like this. I would love to think like, do I like talking about theology over pints? I do indeed. Do I like leather jackets? I do indeed. I
Right.
understand that. I don't understand the kind of intellectual rigor that has no fluff and immediately finds the weak point in an argument. And so I think if anything, I aspire to that which is different than me, and am kind of like, ooh, that's just I don't even know how to handle that. But it's I like even listening to him speak at student conferences. I think you were there, Chris, when he was at Regents. He was this student. A couple of students asked these long-winded, famously academic, long-winded questions where they're really giving their own opinion without asking a question. And Mulhall summed it up with one sentence. He was like, "So what I hear you asking is bam, bam, bam." And I was like, "Go get him, Stephen." And
But that's what
it
I'm
was
saying. But that's what I'm saying. You deep down in your heart, that's what you aspire to become, right?
if I had that
Yeah.
kind of incisive awareness of what synthetic awareness, oh yes, that would be a superpower. That'd be
Okay. So who's closer to the cyborg, Mulhall or Pattison? Because Pattison, to be fair to him, he's got a bit of the
oh
Socratic in him, right? Where
he's
there's
the continental. I think he's the continental cyborg, and I think Mulhall's the analytic cyborg. I really think that's it. I think it's
okay.
The Anglo-American philosophical tradition has Mulhall, and the continental tradition has Pattison, with their all the respective stereotypes they're in. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that was fun. So let's go back to the Republic here. Plato wrote the Republic around 375 BCE. So about 2 decades after the death of Socrates. And many scholars will situate this text in the so-called middle period of Plato's authorship. This is usually considered kind of peak Plato in some respects. A quick side note about this distinction between early, middle, and late. It's roughly chronological, but not necessarily so, because scholars can't say for sure the precise order in which Plato wrote his books, and they can't say with any certainty which ones might have been revised or rewritten at a later date or something like that. So when we differentiate between different authorial periods, we're usually thinking it more in terms of concepts. So the early works
Mhm.
are often considered to be closest to Socrates' own thinking because they usually end in a line of questioning that's not wrapped up. Scholars will call this an aporia, right? There's no solution. You're just left with the puzzle. The middle works are thought to be something of a blend of Socrates and Plato's ideas, where you get this rigorous Socratic dialectic leading the interlocutors into confusion, but then Plato seemingly or allegedly swoops in and kind of ties up the loose knots in some respects. And then most people do think the late works, of which Timaeus would be included, those works are usually ascribed to Plato alone because they feature something more like direct teaching or metaphysical truths in some sense. So the Republic could have been written in different sections of these periods. The first part of the Republic has certain hallmarks with the earlier periods of Plato's corpus. But the later stuff, especially the segment on the myth of which we'll come back to later, seems like it could belong almost to the period around the writing of the Timaeus. So Plato's authorship, again, is sort of a jumble. We can see the Republic is reflecting that in some respects, too. In terms of what was going on in the world this time, not surprisingly, we don't know a whole lot about the world in 375 BCE, but it is worth noting that this was the same year that the Battle of Tagira took place, and this was in central Greece, and this pitted the forces of Thebes versus those of Sparta. At this time, these were the two great political powers in Greece, since, as I mentioned before, Athens had fallen to Sparta decades earlier. And so here again, we can assume that Plato was keeping tabs on political events in Greece, that Thebes won the Battle of Tagira and then emerged as a powerful city state. And we can also see him sort of thinking, okay, this is a transitory event. Athens has been there before. What's going to come next? What is the nature of political power and why has it been poorly mismanaged in Greece? And can we do better? Now, as we said earlier, you're thinking about what the book is about. It's written as a dialogue, reported in the first person by Socrates. And in this narrative, Socrates converses with a lot of different characters, if you will. Most of these are based off of real life people in Athens at the time. So these persons will exhibit different levels of interest in the questions raised by Socrates. Some of them are really passionate about it, some of them agree, some of them disagree. But much of the Republic unfolds as a conversation with Glaucon and Adamantus. These were Plato's actual brothers. Do you want to say anything about that, Clark, before I jump into the general
Nope. No, I'm
division of the
good.
book?
I'm good
Okay.
because I want to go to the general. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So the Republic scholars typically divide it into two main parts. First is a kind of short critical section whereby the Athenian sophist Thrasymachus debates with Socrates about the nature of justice. And Thrasymachus is kind of the boogeyman in the story in a lot of ways. And then there's the longer constructive section of the book, whereby Socrates, in a move that's, Socrates describes what justice might look like in both the individual and in the polis. And he tries to show how his interlocutors might, enact this vision of justice and why it's preferable to that of Thrasymachus, who famously says, quote, justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger, or we might say might makes right. So these are the two overarching sections of the book. Now, there's 10 books in the Republic, and of course, ideally you would read the whole thing, but a few books in particular merit attention. So first is book 1. This is what establishes the Republic's overarching question: what is the essence of justice? Then book 6 describes Plato's conceptions of the ideal state. Book 7 contains the very much celebrated allegory of the cave, which combines Plato's epistemology but relates it to also his politics. And then book 10 makes significant overtures towards religion, and it wraps the whole book up with the so-called myth of Ur, which I'll come back to at the end. Ultimately, Plato, through Socrates, shows that the just person, who, by the way, is a philosopher and pretty much has to be a philosopher. So there is no justice without philosophy for Socrates and for Plato. But in any case, the just person is actually the one capable of doing whatever he wants, because he is capable of discriminating between what is good and what is evil. And for that reason, only seeks the good, because the good is an end in itself. So most people think of justice as kind of an add-on. What really is important, right, is being successful or having money or gaining power. And what Plato wants to say is that no, if you really want to be free and if you really want to be just, then you need to seek the good, because it is a good in and of itself. Any other kind of overview points you want to discuss, Clark?
No, in fact, but I would say this: I think the breakdown of the Republic's really nice because it actually you can read individual books, and I would only contrast that with something like the Timaeus, where it's a sustained dialogue, not unlike like most of, I think, the Platonic dialogues, where there isn't an easy breakdown. So there's kind of an acknowledgement in the Republic that if somebody were listening and wanted to go check out the Republic, it is more accessible in a little bit more of a piecemeal way than I think some of the other dialogues are.
Yeah, and it's sort of like a famous movie or something. Let's say Goodfellas, right? You can go on YouTube and watch like your 5 favorite scenes from Goodfellas, and those scenes are just so outstanding, like the famous Copacabana scene. And people study just that scene. They study only the Copacabana scene as a kind of exemplification of Scorsese's, mastery of cinematic technique, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of like that here. You could just read book 7 of the Republic and study the allegory of the cave. And in a certain sense, you've encountered, if not the most influential idea in the history of Western philosophy, then certainly one of them. And you can see how the text, if not reducible to book 7, but book 7 gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on in the rest of the text. As a sidebar, how entertaining do you think these dialogues are, Clark?
I vary.
Yeah.
I would speak on behalf of my students actually more than I would on myself. I've taught 2 principally. I've taught the Meno, which is one of the dialogues in which basically you get to the end and the question's posed, and it's like, yeah, we don't know. Must be like the question is, what is virtue and where does it come from? And the answer is, we don't know, must come from the gods. And it takes 84 pages to get there. Now, there's a lot of value in it on the way there, and that's the reason I assign it to some of my students. Um, but it's an incredibly frustrating for people accustomed to, let's say, in this case, later Plato, where there is resolution, which is the way most of our teaching is. It's incredibly frustrating to get to the end and not have any kind of resolution. Now, I would also say, though, I think the Republic is a lot more accessible, and partly for the reason that we've already mentioned, but also partly because the ideas therein are really relatable, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
they're also really poignant, because he doesn't land in many cases where we would land, and so it really highlights. And I say we, I mean moderns, postmoderns, and a contemporary West would wildly disagree rather with some of the assumptions or conclusions that he makes and draws. So I think in terms of teaching students, the Meno's tough. the Republic is easy because it's like, hey, here's what, go read whatever, Plato says here and then respond. What do you think about this? And it forces them to at least come up with a different conclusion. So I think the Republic's super accessible, which is one of the reasons I really enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I think that's basically right. And if you don't like reading philosophy, and and your idea of philosophy is something like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, it's just walls of text on very abstract and difficult concepts.
Hashtag
You will
brutal.
find,
Yes.
yeah, you will find Plato's writing to be, I think, rather enjoyable. It is written as a kind of script, right? A kind of discussion or debate between different characters, and in some cases, like you said, in the Meno, it does get abstract at certain places, though it's an illustration, right, of Socrates's,
Hmm. That's right.
idea of recollection. But in the Republic, you do get this very real world, like guys sitting around a bar,
Yes.
essentially talking about what is it that makes you a just person, and somebody steps in and is like, I'm the guy that can do whatever I want to do.
Yeah.
Thrasymachus is kind of the cowboy, the strong man. Socrates is the gadfly. He's the guy that says, well, come on, explain that a little bit more clearly. And so you can get into the debates and you can start seeing character and personality behind the positions in some respects. So it is a good read, I think. And I think generally speaking, among famous philosophers, Plato is one of the better reads, actually. Maybe not as good as Kierkegaard, but yeah.
Easy, Tiger. One question I do ask most of my students is because they read part of the Republic and part of the Meno, and then Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which I think we are going to discuss. I'm going to discuss at some point in one of our future pods, in quick succession. And Aristotle's got a very different vibe than Plato does, um, and so it's always it's good for me to hear which ones they like better. And I would say the classes are almost entirely split 50-50. Like half of them will really enjoy the dialogic style. In addition to Socrates' kind of Socratic, like very overtly humble, like I'm just ignorant. Yeah. You've got to teach me, tell me what you think. And then in contrast, Aristotle's got a little more of an authoritarian style, and it's more discursive. It's just a teaching. And
Right.
so it's really interesting to see the way the different students respond to that. And I'd say, like I said, it's probably right down the middle. So
What about you,
there's
Clark? You a Plato guy, Aristotle guy?
it's tough for me because I just really dig Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I really dig it. And so I love that text so much that I'd probably prefer that to anything that Plato wrote. However, I so much more enjoy teaching Plato's Republic, and honestly think some of the thought experiments there are more interesting. But just the whole of Aristotle's ethics is more interesting to me, if that makes sense.
But
I really appreciate the resonances between a certain kind of Platonism and Christian teaching, and so it resonates with me in a more direct way than some of like certainly Aristotle's cosmology doesn't interest me as much as Plato's does. So when we talk about the Timaeus, I know, and I mean that in a very limited way, but I love the idea of things that are present to us through sense experience not being all that there is. And I'm very, very, very deeply wedded to this idea, for mostly Christian reasons. And so I find a lot of what Plato says, the simile of the cave, I think is very interesting, in the Republic. I'm less convinced by like the political discussions, which is why it's ironic that I love the cave. I'm less inclined towards some of the discussion of the Guardians. So, but again, Nicomachean Ethics is one of my favorite philosophical texts ever. So, I can't get away
yeah,
from
I mean,
Aristotle.
there's Plato is often associated with mysticism, more of an ethereal thinker in some ways. Again, gazing on the forms and how sense experience is to be doubted. And of course, Aristotle is famously a very practical thinker. He's
Yes.
very much rooted in the world. And so, yeah, that's why I said there are two different philosophical styles, both very much influential. Both, by the way, very influential on Christianity. Aristotle's, influence is particularly marked in Catholicism. Plato has probably equal influence on both Catholic and Protestant thinking in some respects. But
Mm-hmm.
these are two seminal thinkers, and yeah, I think they each have a different style. But okay, back to the Republic. So
Whoa, 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 whoa,
yeah,
Turbo. What about you? Would you say
I'm I'm
you're Plato all the
I'm
way
a
through?
play I'm
Yeah.
a
Okay.
Platonist for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah. Got it.
there's no question. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Uh, Not that I've read Nicomachean Ethics, and I find Aristotle's Poetics to be incredibly useful. I could probably have it
That's a good
on this
point.
list.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Aristotle obviously was a genius of his own sort. In many respects, gives us the template for science, which will come to flourishing later in the Christian world. Both thinkers are valuable, but in terms of sensibility, I'm more on the Platonic side of things.
Okay.
Okay, so a book like The Republic, which again ranks pretty much just below the Bible in terms of its cultural importance, is almost impossible to summarize. But I'm going to say there are three themes that stick out to me. Again, Clark, insert your own or comment on this, however you like. All right, the first theme I want to highlight is the existential quest for figuring out how to live well. Okay, because now again, you got to pay attention how Plato sets the scene. The Republic begins in the Piraeus, which is the port of Athens, still there today, big city, where a conversation with the old and wealthy man Cephalus takes a philosophical turn. And Cephalus in particular is talking about getting older, and when you get older, you start seeing what really matters in life. And so Plato indicates already that human life itself raises these profound philosophical and even religious concerns. This would be one of the first texts I ever studied in a philosophy class in undergraduate school. And it made an impression on me because it taught me that intellectual life should not be divorced from practical life. This newer understanding of philosophy as being something abstract, done for specialists, removed from our everyday lives. It's so foreign to Plato's conception of philosophy, which is that philosophy is not an ivory tower pursuit or discipline, but it's really a way of living. It's a way of learning how to live well. And I would recommend, do you know Pierre Hadot's work, Clark?
Nope.
Yeah, he's a French historian of philosophy, but he really tried to recover this idea that the fundamental impulse of philosophy, which stems from Plato, is that it's supposed to transform your life. And so that's the first thing that jumps out to me. It's a text that is very much meant to speak to you and to the questions about how to live well. All right, I'll pause there.
Well, let me just say this: if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's Cephalus. The conversation with him that there's actually a bro moment, like a stereotypical bro moment, where one of them is like, "Hey, Cephalus, can you even still have sex?" And he's like, actually, I'm so glad to be free of that master. Like I'm in possession of my senses, and so to have given up an element of irrational desire is a blessing to me. And it's like this bomb drop on the conversation, and they're like, oh, okay. And then it turns pretty quickly to like these kind of, well, like what else might matter? And I find that actually, so when I signed that text to one of my courses from the Republic, because I think it's a great indicator of like even in our world today, the desire to live forever, to be young forever, to recapture youth, to totally obscures this idea that maybe there are things that from youth that are good to be relinquished and that have a certain place in life. And yet maybe there's a better life. And that is so, I think, radically contrary to the anti-aging element of so many, certainly, drug commercials and stuff like this, or various other, supplements, blah, 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 blah. An attempt to become young again. So
Snapchat filters.
yes.
Right.
And,
Well,
maybe there's something actually, is it? Yeah, no, I don't want to go too far on the merits of the lessening of libido, but nonetheless, I'm going to turn our podcast into an explicit podcast or something like that on accident.
This is Just FYI Pod. It becomes a sex podcast.
Right. No. Yeah.
Right. All right. So, but let me say though, you're right, and it does kind of anticipate where Plato takes the discussion, which is that the guardians, of course, too, have to abstain from certain worldly pleasures in their pursuit of philosophical wisdom, and it's only through their abstinence, if you will. And it's not just sex, but it's really everything. It's money, all the stuff that again we associate with kind of a good life. The guardians of the ideal state have to refrain from or hold in some kind of moderation, which really takes me to the second main theme that I wanted to highlight, which is the challenge of finding a suitable form of government. And I do want to underline the word challenge there because you alluded to this earlier, Clark. I mean, Plato does give you a picture of the ideal form of government, but can this government ever be put into practice? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
there have been sort of aborted attempts or half measures to realize the form of government envisioned by Plato, but it's not something that's very easily done. And what you do wind up with are a bunch of inferior forms of government. And I want to say a little bit more about that. So in Book 8 of the Republic, Plato cycles through various forms of the state or government and dismisses each of them as inferior to what he thinks is the ideal form of government, which is basically aristocracy. Now,
Well,
immediately
Chris,
to
can
my
can I interrupt you? I'm
yeah,
really sorry to do this
please,
right in the middle of your
yeah,
comment, but I
yeah.
think if I'm listening to this, what is the connection between? Because on the one hand, we're talking about being rational and having self control over desire, and on the other hand, we're talking about governments. But I think there's a real private and public distinction that we would make in the world right now that would be like, well, what does the government have to do with self-control or the relationship of my mind to desire and these sorts of things? And I think at this point it would be, I mean, feel free to jump in and answer that. Or, I mean, I think it stands to reason that that for Plato, and certainly even more so maybe for Aristotle, there is this assumption that the the political life is a direct correlate for individual moral life. Like this idea of the individual that we have today is not shared by the ancient world, and in particularly not by like these, again, these kind of Greek city states wherein, there are obviously guardians over against non-guardians, but you basically are the people you are a part of. And so in that context, having a politics is directly impinges on, or rather, maybe I should say this: the moral quality of the person, of the people, directly affects the government and vice versa. And if we don't make that
Well,
connection, go ahead. Yeah.
I jumped from really book 1 to book 8, and so there are discussions of this point earlier. I think you're right. In a certain way, Plato is a kind of postmodern thinker. I mean, ironically enough, because he does think that culture, history, government, these things form the kind of citizen that you are. And like you
Yes.
said, there is a kind of
Yes.
correlation between the individual and his or her context. And this really comes out in these intermediate books that lead up to the allegory of the cave. And this is why it matters so much to Plato about kind of getting the government right. Because if you don't get the government right, then individuals are not going to pursue the highest good. And they're going to be sort of swamped by baseless of irrational passions and so on and so forth. So the government needs to be formed well so that individuals can live well. And I think that's basically the underlying assumption in his working out of the ideal form of government. Do you agree with
Yes,
that?
I
Yeah.
absolutely agree with that. Yeah,
Okay.
but yes,
But
I think
yeah.
my only real comment would be also though that there is a sense of nature involved here. So it's like it's everything you said, but then added. It's not that we're just how we're formed by education or government or something like this, but it's also that we have an intrinsic nature that we're effectively given, or that we, and that then in consult, like in response to that nature, is then furthered or stymied by education, government, etc. And so it's this constant process of like, if you are a person of gold, a gold nature, shall we say, to use the metal example used elsewhere in the Republic, like if you're made of gold, you have this kind of gold nature rather than a bronze nature or a dirt nature. I don't. That's made up the dirt nature part. Um, but then that can be either refined further or it can be polluted by the way that you're. And so I guess when we say that he values education and government, these external forces on oneself, it's not just those things. It's that there is an intrinsic nature and that those are either impeded or furthered by the context in which one finds themselves. But that's the only caveat I'd put on that.
Yeah, okay. And I think some of that will become clear
Yeah.
as I go on here. So for Plato, the ideal form of government is a kind of aristocracy, but this does not mean, highborn elite landowners or something. We're not talking about like the landed gentry in Britain in the 18th century or something. What Plato is talking about is a government led by those who are aristos, right? Or aristocracy, aristos, the best of their kind. That's what that word means in Greek. These are the wisest and most noble, and they are dedicated to the common good. And one of the things that's really interesting, again, this goes back to what we were just saying about this sort of symbiotic relationship between polis and the individual soul, is that for Plato, these kind of rulers are made, not born. Plato calls these figures, they're philosopher kings or philosopher rulers. And as he sees it, they would be selected from childhood for their moral character and their physical ability. So Plato, he envisions a kind of meritocracy in some respects, but again, not necessarily centered on wealth or power. Promising childhood candidates would be then educated and trained in the superiority of reason, philosophy, and then curbing their appetites for money, sex, power, and these kind of things. And then the best of these philosophers would rule together as wise and benevolent kings. Now you might say, oh, but they'll get corrupted. No, no, no. Plato says, nope, nope, because to avoid temptation and corruption, these philosopher kings, these rulers would not receive an income. They would not be able to own private property, and they would share things in common with each other. Even their wives and children would be held in common. And Plato generally speaks of these persons as guardians of the polis. They're the ones that protect it. But what are they protecting it against? Anyway, do you want to say anything about the guardians, Clark, before I go on?
No, I mean, you've already hit the high points. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
So what are they protecting us against? Well, they're protecting us against worse forms of government, which, as we just said a minute ago, then impede the development of the soul. So, what are these worst forms of government? Well, this is what Plato kind of goes through in Book 8. So, one inferior form of government would be a timocracy, which is more or less modeled after Sparta. This is a kind of hero culture centered on military conquest and so on, like buying Greenland. I gotta say, but in any case, a democracy such as Sparta can talk about how powerful it is culturally and how it's had all these military victories and so on and so forth. But Plato says it's going to fall because it's centered on war and pride and not on reason. It's not rooted in philosophical principles, but rather rooted in military, conquest. The next form of government that sort of fails, and actually in a worse way, is oligarchy. And this was a word, very ironically, I thought, invoked by President Biden last night. Did you hear about this, Clark?
I mean, I know he addressed the country. I don't know what you're talking about. What?
Yeah, yeah. He said something to the effect of, I don't have the quote in front of me. And I guess this was supposed to be like his Eisenhower moment. Eisenhower famously invoked the military industrial complex in 1961. And so Biden last night says, well, we got to be on the lookout for these oligarchs, for a guy who's been cavorting with Soros. I think he's really just mad that Zuckerberg abandoned him and put Facebook under the aegis of Trump now. So I don't know. I mean, we got to be worried about all kind of oligarchs. I agree with Biden on that front, and Plato would agree too. Plato would say, "Yes, Biden, but are you an oligarch?" But in any case, Plato says like oligarchy is trouble because then what you wind up with is a government led by the wealthy, led by people who are looking out for their own material interest in some way. But you might say, what about democracy? Plato says that's even worse than
Yeah, that's right.
oligarchy.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think this is a really provocative section of the book, and it's one that people should read. Again, this is book 8. But even worse than an oligarchy is a democracy, since democracies are run according to the whims of the mob, and they lack order and purpose. And when you have this culture of individual passions, ungoverned, it's basically like being on the internet or something. It's like surfing Twitter. When this becomes kind of the way you think about everything, then what do? Plato says, well, this leads to the worst form of government at all. And this is a deficiency that asks people to start looking for a strong man who will govern the people and bring order to chaos. But usually, this protector that emerges is not a guardian on Plato's model, but rather a tyrant. And so we're moving on a kind of continuum from aristocracy all the way to tyranny. And of course, tyranny is, in fact, the worst form of government. And if tyranny is okay, then Thrasymachus wins, right? Remember, this goes back to the beginning of the text.
Yeah.
Thrasymachus is the advocate for might makes right, justice is the advantage of the stronger. So Plato positions himself at the far other end of the political spectrum and says, no, we need philosopher kings. And of course, I think we can see just from this discussion, the reality is somewhere usually in between oligarchy, democracy. We've seen different versions of these governments. But Plato would ask us to consider, will any of these governments actually deliver in the way that a government rooted in philosophy and truth and reason could? And I think it's a fair question. I'm going to pause there. I have one more key theme to highlight, but I'm going to pause there. What do you guys say there, Clark?
Just my students love this part because
They
they're
get
like,
enraged. They get mad about the
yes,
democracy
yeah.
stuff.
They're like,
Yeah.
wait a second, what about and it's such the disconnect is always that it's the disconnect between the assumption that an individual person knows enough to be in charge of their life and to do well in their own life. And Plato clearly doesn't share that assumption. He clearly, as you stated earlier, believes that that people, again, of all different kind of types and sorts and giftings, are actually not going to likely choose what is either good for themselves or good for others, and therefore they need to be restrained. And so that element of restraint is something that is provides no end of consternation for my students.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing, right? Because when we say that this form of government won't work, Plato's form of government, I mean, it's just because we don't really believe in reason to that extent, right? It's like
Yeah, and I
we
think
we could never have that.
well,
Yeah.
I think it may be that Plato simply believes that that everything tends to imperfection, and for him, that's all it is, a tendency to imperfection, and thus it must be limited or constrained. But it's not a fall. It's not. So maybe it's a difference of degree. It's not a complete falling away from knowledge, truth, goodness, beauty. It's just like maybe I would describe it. And again, to preface some of the Timaeus, it's like a machine that no matter what machine that you have, if it's in like in any kind of mechanistic sense, if it runs for long enough, it's going to break down. Because
Mhm.
even with something that is perfectly designed, uh, in time and space and in a world, it will degenerate eventually. And therefore, in that manner, the cosmos is always in need of adjustment, and political systems are the same. So I think that it, but it's certainly not the machine's bad. And that would be something that would be, I think, very connectable with um, a Christian doctrine of fall would be, no, like there's a, and again, depends on your tradition, of course, but there's some kind of intrinsic brokenness that actually cannot be overcome by itself. And that is where I think the difference of, what kind of problem is it that we face as human beings comes into sharp relief. So,
Yeah, and I think we might be talking past one another. I guess what I was referring to in particular was this idea that we don't really trust that you could implement something like the Guardians or a system of philosopher kings. We don't trust that because we tend to doubt that people could ever be that, let's say, disinterested in themselves, that there is an assumption of sinfulness, self-interestedness, self-centeredness that is, I think part and parcel with our understanding of the world, again, especially in the wake of Christian teaching, of biblical teaching. And I think Plato, he's not really hampered by those concerns, right? I mean,
yeah,
again, I don't know if we're
no, I
talking
totally
about,
agree. I think,
yeah,
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 I totally agree. I think the only caveat I'd make is that for Plato, it's manageable. It's not that you can absolutely identify the perfect philosopher king, as much as you could get a lot closer than we believe you could today in echoing your point. And if there are small differences, if the machine starts to wobble a little bit, it is perfectly within the realm of the guardians and human knowledge, reason, wisdom to be able to repair it. And that, to your point, is what
okay,
is
right.
not present, I think, in a tradition wedded to a Christian notion of fall, where it's like, no, 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 no. This machine is not just like, there's not a little rattle. Something else has gone more
Yeah, yeah,
significantly
yeah.
wrong.
Okay. No, I see how our points connect now. Okay. My final key theme I want to highlight, and again, we probably need to be moving forward pretty quickly here, but the final theme I would want to highlight is the indispensableness of religion and the immortality of the soul. And this is
Mm-hmm.
how the Republic ends. There's a discussion, fairly lengthy, of the immortality of the soul. And basically, it comes down to this, that even though the person's pursuit of justice will come at a dear cost, again, think about all the guardians have to give up to form the ideal state. Think about how the person of reason has to discipline his or her passions in some ways. But Plato goes on and says, look, there's a reward in eternity. We talked about Nietzsche at the very beginning today. This is where Nietzsche hated Plato with a true passion, and you can see why. Because for Plato, at the end, it's sort of like, hey, you got to give up all this stuff in this world, but ultimately there'll be a reward. And the same goes for the unjust person who is living by his animal appetites. Well, that person will be punished in the next life. And in order to illustrate this, Plato even goes into a religious myth of some sort more like a near-death experience that was that a warrior named encountered. I think he was pulled from his funeral pyre and had seen the afterlife in some respects. The way describes it, there is an afterlife, and in this afterlife, the just again are rewarded, and the unjust are punished. And so Socrates slash Plato basically says, look, the way of life is the way of choice, and the choices that we make affect our ultimate destiny. And if we're going to ultimately avoid eternal disaster, then we have to take steps day by day through our governments, but also through the way we live to realize our full rational potential. And that's sort of where the book ends. Religion is the kind of underpinning. It's not just that Plato thinks a life of philosophy by itself is good enough, but he thinks that you do need some kind of account of the immortality of the soul to help justify why one would give up these worldly goods, power, prestige, money, and so on, why one would give those things up to begin with. And he does think it's connected again to a kind of vision of the afterlife. So those are my three key themes of the book. Again, the existential quest for figuring out how to live well, the challenge of finding a suitable form of government, and then finally, the indispensableness of religion. Now, those are three key themes in the text.
Okay, let me ask you one quick question, and it's
Yeah,
it's an
sure.
unscripted one, but you bring it up. How do you think the relation of an ultimate destination relates to the recollection you mentioned earlier and the clear emphasis on incarnation? I mean, reincarnation in Plato's later work, like the Timaeus, and even to some extent, I don't recall all that well in the Republic. Like, so are we saying that there is a series of reincarnations, and then that once the soul reaches a certain whatever nobility, and this is me, by the way, I'm not setting you up, I don't know the answer to this, so it may be like the only way I can conceive of it is that if it's that there is such an adherence to the intent of the god that then one is finally taken from the world permanently. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I don't have an answer either, but I'm glad you mentioned reincarnation because, again, it bears emphasizing Plato is not writing this from a Christian standpoint. He's not Christian. This is before the time of Jesus. There's a synthesis of different sources running through the Republic. Many of them are of Socrates' and Plato's own devising, of course, rooted in philosophy and the search for truth. But then, like you said, there's these religious myths that crop in, and they're very much tied to this idea of reincarnation, which, of course, is prominent in other world religions as well. So when Plato defends the immortality of the soul, he's not making a defense for Christianity in some respects, though many Christian thinkers have gravitated towards Plato as a kind of forerunner of Christian truth. There's analogies that can be made between Platonic thought and Christian ideas of heaven or hell, but it is closer, as you said, Clark, to reincarnation. And I think that's itself a metaphysical philosophy that's debated in various world religions. So I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer either. And I don't think I was just even flipping through the Timaeus here. I don't think it's actually articulated there either, despite a preponderance of interest in reincarnation. So, okay, well, great. If somebody listening wants to send an email and be like, "Hey, you guys are dumb. You guys are dumb. Here's how it relates." Well, then by all means, send away. Click send.
Well, again, and what I remember sticking out to me, and this maybe ties into the question we usually like to dig into, which is how does this book change your life? Here's this book devoted towards these would seemingly be secular pursuits, right? Government, justice, and then also this very rigorous form of education and training that Plato recommends that's not rooted in religion or anything like that. He's even quite critical of poetry at different junctures in the Republic. But then it ends with a myth, right? And it ends with something that's kind of poetic and ethereal in some ways. And I think that itself indicates maybe the fragility of Plato's project. Again, this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, that there is a challenge that's raised by Plato to think of what an ideal form of government would be, but can we actually effectuate that in the world? And can we actually offer something like pure reason to people? No, it seems that even pure reason has to be supported by something like revelation or myth in some respects. And again, those I don't want to conflate revelation and myth altogether, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave it like that. And the more that I thought about Plato's approach, the more I've really been gripped by it, I think this is how it changed my life, is that the premise of the Republic and really all of Plato's work is that we don't actually know what we're talking about. If somebody came back and said, here's what it means, this is it, then I think in a way we do a disservice to Plato, because one of the things that he wants to say is that if we scrutinize what we're saying, we're going to realize that eventually we're going to run into contradictions, or we're going to run into aporias and we can't answer everything. And we toss around concepts like justice or truth. This is why I think I'm such a skeptic about media in so many respects, because headlines or newspaper articles tend to encapsulate things very simply, sort of look at it like, well, what did that mean exactly? And I think another thing that's worth noting is that Plato doesn't seem to think that this is just a problem that education can fix. Because if you think about the people in his dialogues that are the biggest blowhards, are the most educated, like Thrasymachus and Gorgias. These are sophists. These are the academics of their era. And so Plato reminds us that just because an academic says it doesn't mean it's true, or just
Mhm.
because a headline says it doesn't mean it's true. You have to ask questions. And so wisdom isn't just a sheer accumulation of knowledge. This reminds me a great deal of Kierkegaard as well. Being wise isn't just about knowing a whole bunch of stuff. It's also about knowing what you don't know. And
Mhm.
I think that is a core Platonic insight that has always affected me. And I think it probably did kind of tee me up to fall in love with Kierkegaard, who, again, famously is considered kind of a modern day Socrates in a lot of ways. And I don't think I ultimately enjoy Kierkegaard the way that I have and study Kierkegaard with the intensity that I have over the years if I hadn't read The Republic first. So I think that's how it influenced my life.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there is a real sense of what would be the right way to put it? The relationship of knowledge to wisdom and humility is like this triangle almost. And again, I'm sure there's a much better Platonic way of thinking about it than this. But those things are always in play. And so wisdom, it would be hard to have wisdom totally absent knowledge of any kind. And it would be hard to have wisdom without humility. And at the same time being humble and not like being an entirely cynical or skeptical person and saying like, no, 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 no. I am just humble and that I don't know anything. Like you become an
Mhm.
animal at the same time. And so I think this is where, it's not like you just don't trust anybody. It's also though the quest is for a kind of right knowledge. And I mean, Plato himself makes a big deal about this in the Meno, about, and as well as in the Timaeus, about the difference between opinion and knowledge, and belief
Right.
and understanding and intelligence, and so it's like this quest for the right kind of knowledge that is basically we would probably call something much more akin to wisdom, which is always limited, always, always, always. And certainly so it's almost to your point, like the whenever that knowledge appears omniscient or so definitive that it is beyond question, yeah, our antennae should be you know buzzing like crazy, going, okay, something's wrong here. And that's a tough tension to kind of straddle almost, or to navigate, because it's you know there are some things that are very clear or that seem very clear, and there are other things that seem very unclear, but those things change over the course of a life, so it seems like there's very little to stand on at times.
Right. And I think, well, I'll come back to this actually in the categories. So I want to say another word about Kierkegaard and his interest in this. So well, let's go ahead and jump to the categories because we need to get
Yeah, 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 of course.
moving to the Timaeus as
Well,
well.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, let me. I don't know how to ask this in a. Is there a key passage? I mean, I'll give you a couple because I think there's almost have to be a couple in this book, right? I mean, the category of
Well,
key
I
passage.
got one
Okay.
pegged, but I mean, I
Okay,
don't
go,
say, I
go.
mean, again, I'm with you. I mean, because of the nature, the way it's written, right, as
Okay.
a dialogue. But, I think that the easy answer here is the allegory of the cave. And this
Yeah.
is found in books 7. And if you go with the kind of traditional numbering of Platonic dialogues, this is 514a and then concluding at 518d. So this is a lot of text. I'm not going to read the whole thing. All right, don't worry. But I think it's a kind of summary point in the text that I think says a lot about the way Plato conceives of the philosophical life. So he says, and this is a quote: "Our current argument," this is Socrates, I should say, Our current argument indicates a different way of conceiving this capacity for learning we each have within our soul, in the instrument with which each of us learns. It is more like an eye that cannot be turned from the dark towards the bright unless the whole body turns with it. It must be turned around, together with the whole soul, away from things that change, until it becomes able to bear looking at what is, in the most dazzling part of what is, and that, we say, is the good. So in this quote, Plato carves out a key role for philosophy, and I think he also opens up a way for thinking about, again, the mystical life in some respects. Platonic thinking is profoundly influential on early Christian mysticism, and it goes back to thinkers such as Justin Martyr. It's later almost in a way codified by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who we talked about in our section on theology last season. So anyway, I think that's an important text. Again, this passage from darkness towards light, the whole soul, seeing things clearly, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, I can't wait to hear what you say about this. Who hates this book? And let's say you can't say Aristotelians or something like that.
Yeah, right. First, to your point, anybody who wants a good education should, in theory, have an interest in the Republic, right? It is one of the greatest texts in Western cultural history. But if we're reading sincerely, then the Republic should get under your skin a little bit, because Socrates did provoke anger in his interlocutors. And he did that because he suggested that they weren't really clear about what they were saying, or they didn't really know what they said they knew. I have a debt here to Kierkegaard, because on the concept of irony, with constant reference to Socrates, his 1841 doctoral dissertation or magister dissertation, Kierkegaard called Socrates' standpoint, drawing on the Platonic works, not those by Xenophon. He calls Socrates' standpoint infinite absolute negativity. And what he means to say by that is this: that Socrates intended to tear down established assumptions and shibboleths in order to prepare the way for the arrival of eternal truth. But he had no control over eternal truth, and he was simply a midwife working on its behalf. And so for Socrates, this standpoint of infinite absolute negativity is kind of like a bulldozer over what the typical presuppositions of society are. So then I guess who would hate the book? I think it would have to be dogmatists, propagandists, sophists, people who profit from trading in abstract propositions that promote canned wisdom and popular schleck, or the kind of stuff that, again, works on a headline, or when you sum up an entire philosophy or opinion on Facebook in like 3 sentences or something. These sorts of people would have to be offended, I think, by the infinite absolute negative standpoint of Socrates. So in this regard, I think the form of the Republic says about as much as its content.
Whew. Makes me wonder about doing a podcast about Plato in like an hour and a half. We're like, this is it. This is it. This is the whole thing. Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
What are you
No,
gonna
it's
drink?
true.
What do you drink while reading this?
Okay, so this was a toughie, because obviously this is a milestone of ancient Greek culture. And you would think, okay, like I need a Mediterranean drink. And actually, I Googled this. What's a great Greek wine? But it appears that Greece is not a great wine drinking country. Surprisingly, actually, I don't know. Then I thought, okay, something with an olive in it, right? Because
Oh no.
because yeah,
Okay,
right,
right.
because Greece remains one of the world's top producers of olives. It's fifth in the world, Clark, trailing Spain, Italy, Morocco, and Turkey. Okay, so I thought a martini. Then I looked at martinis; they were developed in California. Okay, nevertheless, I'm going to stick with a martini, and in particular, a good dirty martini. I think is the ideal drink to have when you're reading the Republic. Do you drink martinis?
I don't. I find myself shaken, not stirred,
Oh
by your proposition
gosh,
of a
that's
martini.
so bad.
You're welcome. You're
That's
welcome.
so bad. So a dirty martini, right, is a martini that's made with olive juice. It's sort of mixed in some brine, and so
Yummy.
it's kind of salty. It's fantastic. And so I think if you have like a good briny martini, it's going to give you that old world patrician feel, that kind of aristocratic feel, elegant, refined, perfect for a warm, sunny day. You're debating perennial philosophical ideas. I think you can't do much better than the dirty martini for reading Plato.
It's so good that we're partners in this because I would never have come up with that in a million years. Okay, but that's the purpose of the category, I suppose. All right, man, it's time. We've messed around with the other categories. Let's go to the one that
Yes.
matters. The best
All
category
right.
of all categories, the platonic ideal of categories. Give us your haiku.
So yet again, I mean, probably spend more time thinking about the drink than the haiku, but I came up with something of a humorous haiku, which I don't think is any good, but nevertheless, here it is. Thrasymachus claimed justice is strength, but Plato said, "Hold my beer." That's my haiku.
Okay, all right. Oh my gosh, we can't take you anywhere, Chris. Okay.
Yeah, all right.
All right. Where do you have any final comments?
No, it's good. We should take a break because we've already gone, pretty good while here. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll discuss Timaeus and then get into your podcast categories and wrap it up for today. Okay, we are back here to discuss Plato again. We just finished a fairly long session on Plato's Republic. Now, Clark is going to dig into his selection for this week, which is really kind of an addendum to the Republic, which we both covered and dealt with last segment. Now we're going to focus on the Timaeus, which is one of Plato's later works. And I will say, Clark, before you get started, from my standpoint, the Timaeus is a great uh, counterexample of the Christian doctrine on creation, right? Creatio ex nihilo, famously in Christianity, refers to God's creation out of nothing. Plato offers a different vision of how God brought the world into form, and I think that's where this book sticks out for me.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. I came across the Timaeus because in the Republic you get these kind of hints in these directions about things. I was particularly interested in and I want to be very clear: the Timaeus does not discuss the forms in great detail, but the Republic does in the Simile of the Cave. And I say even then, maybe perhaps not in great detail, but it lends this kind of two-tiered notion of what is into kind of that which is attached to the soul and that which is attached to sensate life, that is embodied life in some respect. And because Platonism was such a made such a deep impact on Christian theology, I was like, well, gosh, where can I learn more about kind of the cosmology? And this is now, years ago, the cosmology that Plato's working from. And you get probably no better iteration, no better explanation of this than you would in Timaeus. And I would say in some respects, I feel like that the Timaeus is akin in the Greek tradition to something like Hesiod's Works and Days, where and for those who don't know, I mean, basically the two great poets in Greek antiquity are Homer and Hesiod, um, and that's it. And much of what people understand from Greek mythology comes from, indeed, um, later it's Ovid in terms of or Ovid. I don't. How do you say that? Ovid or Ovid? Do you
I
know?
would say Ovid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. Anyway, in the Roman tradition, but in the Greek tradition, it's Hesiod, and then whatever you get kind of in the narrative of Homer. So, so really, there aren't tons of rivals. But what's interesting is that Plato's Timaeus stands out in sharp contrast to even that, because um, Hesiod does discuss the kind of emergence of the gods, but is very interested in kind of the relationships between these gods. Whereas Plato in the Timaeus doesn't really do any of that. He actually he will describe some of the names of the most famous gods, but basically they are the uh, kind of subsidiary creators, actors. They are the
Hmm.
halfway house between what he calls the demiurge, which literally means craftsman, um, and human beings. So it's interesting that in Hesiod, the gods are these kind of super beings, and they are still that to some extent in the Timaeus, but not in the same way. So what's interesting, I think what's the disadvantage of the Timaeus, and I want to be very upfront about this immediately. One thing that is tough and maybe this is a legacy of my own interest in Christianity and certainly Judeo-Christian creation narratives, and maybe even just Semitic creation narratives altogether, is that they generally have very little to do with mathematics. And this is in a sharp contrast to the way the Greeks, at least certainly the Platonic traditions, think about math. So, for example, in the Meno, you can understand fundamental realities through the formation of knowledge using nothing other than mathematical reason alone. And in the Timaeus, basically the order of creation, and this is going to be a key point for Plato, it is seen in mathematical shapes. And this is also what's going to place Plato in sharp contrast to some of the prior Greek traditions, like that of the atomism of Democritus. So, for example, or what I mean by this is Democritus rather famously believed that there were these kind of fundamental realities that, something like we would call atoms or particles, but they had neither shape nor form. So they were, or rather, all different. There was no uniform shape or form. So that basically everything that came into being based on a desire for similarities, so things that were like gravitated towards like, that basically because of this, order, or what appears to be order in the world, is nothing other than the congregation of like with like. And Plato says, no, Democritus, you're an idiot. And he doesn't say that literally. He says that obviously, but it's clear that Democritus and Leucippus, I think is how I'd pronounce his name, as another representative of this tradition, are just flat wrong. And that actually there is a real order to that which is, and it reflects the intrinsic order of the demiurge, of the craftsman. Now, and I'm not going to keep calling it the craftsman. I'm going to call it the demiurge instead. But the demiurge, the difference
That's
between
also your nickname on the basketball court, isn't it?
the
The
demiurge.
demiurge.
I don't know if that's a good nickname or a terrible nickname. I don't know. The one who
It
falls.
should
Anyway,
be. Right.
um, so the what's interesting though is that the demiurge creates in imitation of itself. The difference and the problem is the demiurge is eternal, and because it is eternal and not created, it when it creates, there is already a fundamental difference between it and what it creates. So this is going to be really important because when Plato in the Timaeus begins to articulate what the problem is, why is there any problem, something like evil or things that don't work right, eventually it will result in this, it will almost date back to this slippage between that which is uncreated, the demiurge, and that which is created, that is everything that is the cosmos. So
I'm going to pause you right there
yeah,
just
please.
because you can already see how this both connects to Christian theology or Christian accounts of creation, and then how it differs as well.
Yes.
And it makes me think too of the massive philosophical question of the problem of evil, which, like you said, is already kind of baked into any theory of creation and what creation is. One of my favorite writings on the Christian doctrine of creation is Rowan Williams's, the great Anglican theologian. Rowan Williams's piece on being creatures, which he put out in his text on Christian theology, I think years ago. It was probably early 2000s, I think. But, his account of God creating simply for the sake of creating, right? For the sake of creating something good. And that God's intrinsic motivation is simply the good of the other. I'm curious, why does the demiurge create or fashion the world? Like what is the underlying rationale from the demiurge's standpoint?
That's an interesting question. He he being Plato basically talks about there being this interest in the gods, and that creation, I want to be very careful about using even the very, very Christian loaded language of creation for what Plato's talking about, because here
Yeah, that's
again,
fair.
creation does have a valence of care, I think, in the Christian and Judeo-Christian tradition, that it doesn't have in the Timaeus in the same way. But having said
Right.
that,
Well,
I mean,
and then like, I'm sorry to jump in again, but that
no,
that
please.
actually is kind of what I'm asking. So you're right. In Christianity, God God's impulse to create is simply to create the good, to create that which is good. Um, it's something that God does of his own accord without any sort of compulsion. And that's what I'm saying. What is the difference there? I think you're right to draw the distinction between them. So what is the impulse to create? Where does it come from for the Platonic demiurge?
So the answer is that he would, in a desire being perfect beauty and goodness, which now this is a key point I think that is fundamentally different from other creation narratives. For Plato, it is essential, and I mean that in the technical sense. It is essential to the demiurge that it is good, and that is out of just de fide almost. I mean, you can't get beyond it. So he has this passage at the very outset of the dialogue when Timaeus first begins speaking. He says, I should explain then how this created universe came to be made by its maker. He was good, and nothing good is ever characterized by mean-spiritedness over anything, being free of jealousy. And this is, I think, the answer to your question. He wanted everything to be as similar to himself as possible. Wise men tell us there is no more important precondition for the created world than this, and we cannot go wrong if we were to accept it. So basically, what it seems to be is that this was a foregone conclusion. And again, to Williams's point, I don't know that I'd go so far as to say it's necessity that the demiurge, because to say that everything should be good like the demiurge presumes there are other things like the demiurge, like that could be like the demiurge, meaning a kind of pre-creation. So to your point, it begs, I think it invites invites an answer of perhaps by necessity, and because there was no choice but to craft, being the craftsman, that in light of that impulse, everything that was crafted had to be perfect, or at least as close to it as it could be made.
So it's been a long time since I read the Timaeus, but there's a kind of primordial stuff,
Yes,
right? That's
yes,
there, which I think does imply some kind of necessity, as you just alluded to. It's there, and the demiurge is good, so the demiurge has to create it, because what else is the demiurge going to do but create good stuff? Like, it's like a painter. We have a world-class painter, and then you surround him with various canvases and paints and oils and things of that nature, and of course the painter's going to pick them up and start painting. But there is some kind of pressure, if you will, on the demiurge. It's not willed of itself, right? It's some kind of response to something. The demiurge needs to create.
yes,
And the demiurge needs to create good things, but it needs to. It gets something from creation. Whereas, according to the Christian teaching of creatio ex nihilo, creation is not needed by God. God doesn't get stronger or bigger or any satisfaction in a kind of derivative way from creating. God simply creates because God wills to create. I
yes.
don't know.
I think that's
It's a
absolutely
different
correct.
inflection point, right? It's a different inflection point on why things are here at all. And like you said earlier, and I think you're 100% right, it also then becomes a complicated question as to then why are not all things good? I think Plato actually has an easier answer to that question than Christianity does, frankly.
I think that's probably true. Now,
Yeah.
the other thing, the next day, I stopped reading right before he said, um, to
Yeah.
answer what you
Sorry
said a
about that.
moment ago.
Yeah.
No. He being the demiurge, found everything visible in a state of turmoil, moving in a discordant and chaotic manner. So he led it from chaos to order, which he regarded in all ways better. So to the point that we've just made, that there is a pre-existent goop, but it is entirely without form or function or order of any kind. And so, of course, that can't be allowed to stand. So it is definitively not a situation of creatio ex nihilo. It's
Right.
like he shows up and realizes out of his goodness and being good, ooh, I got to make sense of this. And that's exactly what he does. Now, what that here again, the problem of evil then is like I said a moment ago, that he being in some sense eternal and disconnected with that which is made can only make things that are at least at some remove from himself. And that remove is the slippage that leads eventually, if indulged, or rather not realized. And this is going to take me to the second point. that I think because I've almost, by the way, moved entirely to the themes because we've talked enough about Plato that I think we can get there.
Sure.
The
Yeah.
second theme is that everything, because the demiurge is ordering, everything is ordered. And the key word there is everything. There is nothing within the created world that does not have an intrinsic order and design to it. And so when you look at like what we would say are the great teleological systems of thinking, these systems predicated on design, and as Thomas Aquinas will argue, if there's a design, then there must be a designer, in the teleological argument for the existence of God. In the same way, every single purpose of the human body or every single function of the human body has a very distinctive purpose. And this is a uniquely Platonic move, from that you can infer things about the demiurge itself. So it's
Right.
not just that there's an order that is totally intrinsic to human beings, but nothing else. No. You can look, for example, at the circulation of the blood and infer things about the orbits of the planets and vice versa. So what this means is that it opens up this world of a kind of I hesitate to even call it science in the way that, because it gives too many other connections, but you can understand the world using things intimate to human processes and human beings, because we are nothing other than a smaller version of what we see writ large on the natural world. Now, this makes the function of this, the big takeaway is that it makes the entire natural world intelligible. And
Right.
it's
And
not
it is, by the way, is another point of inheritance in Christian thinking that
right.
the world, right. So keep going. But yeah.
That's it. That God is,
Yeah.
because God is rational, we can intuit or know things about the world. And at least in the Christian tradition, and because it's designed, it reflects the designer. And Plato is just hyper. He takes this to the nth degree, basically, to where you can look at the most minute things. Another feature, and I started talking about this, and then took it in a different direction a moment ago, but there is a mathematical base of almost every single thing, to be specific, a geometrical base of everything that exists, because everything that exists is made of one of four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. And so when these are the most foundational, so we talked about atomism a moment ago, these are the fundamental particles, or the fundamental stuff that makes up everything that is. So you can take, for example, and this is a really bad example, and you probably need to read the Timaeus if you want to understand this with any kind of competence, but like, which I'm not even sure I can do. The point is, you take one little mini fire particle, which has a particular shape, and if you have enough of those, which glom onto each other, then you might have the visible reality of fire. The same element can transmute through certain combinations into other elements. So you could, for example, use, and this is how you would explain fire turning earth or wood into something else, or mud solidifying into turning from water. So earth and water creating mud, which forms something slightly different. But at the end of the day, mud is nothing other than water and earth. And so if you could drill down to its essence, it would still be nothing other than fire shapes and earth shapes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
Yeah.
this is in sharp contrast to something here again, like some of the former Socratic Greek schools, wherein there was something more like an arithmetic way of thinking about that which is, so even something like um, Euclid, who is obviously the founder of geometry, um, wouldn't speak of the very foundation of all things geometrically necessarily. It could still be something about numbers and not about shapes, if that makes sense. And so that's one of the distinctive elements of Plato's kind of foundational understanding of matter, of that which is. And you can see how too this is one of the reasons why, when you look at the way we think about even something like the periodic table today, and you look at you've got these distinctive elements that nonetheless can combine and form these kind of these unique combinations of elements which look entirely differently, yet at the same time are nothing other than these foundational elements. Plato's not that far off, given a complete lack of understanding about what those elements actually are, or and I say what they actually are. That actually could get into a really interesting discussion about what whether or not the elements describe what is. But anyway,
Well, yeah, I want to jump in real quick and just
yeah,
say, yeah,
please.
one reason why this book is placed in his later period of writings is because it does create something like his picture of
Yes.
the nature of things, his metaphysics. I'm going back to a couple of works by Etienne Gilson, the French philosopher. He did a lot of these kind of histories of metaphysics, and talks about how Thales the Milesian was the first metaphysician, because
Mm,
Thales had this kind of idea that all things come from water. And so the first move to try to understand the nature of reality, the first metaphysical question is like, what is it? What is this world that we're in? What is it made of? Where does it come from? And then from that initial impulse, like you said, you get more elaborate systems of metaphysics. And Gilles Salm was one, obviously being a Thomist, does not believe you can do philosophy without metaphysics. I think I basically agree. I mean, I struggle with this question because I'm obviously also interested in Heidegger, who was profoundly skeptical about metaphysical systems because they try to, as it were, imprison being and make being available to our own uses. And I think that's also true. It's easy for a metaphysic to become something that you kind of manipulate and use. But in any case, I like where you're going here in terms of situating the Timaeus in a kind of debate that's emerging at that time in Greece, which of course spills over into the Western world eventually as well.
yeah, I mean, and I want to read a quick passage. And it's not certainly not the essential passage, but it does highlight exactly Plato's position, or rather Timaeus's, but I think Plato's. Um, he even says, it'll take an unusual argument, but you'll be able to follow it because you're familiar with the intellectual disciplines I shall draw on in my account. The starting point is, of course, universally accepted. I love that fire, earth, water, and air are material bodies. Now, this means that, like all bodies, they have depth, and anything with depth is necessarily surrounded by surfaces. And any rectilinear surface consists of triangles. There are two basic triangles from which all triangles are derived, and each of them has one right angle and two acute angles. And he proceeds to talk about identifying, for example, the beauty of the most beautiful of scaling triangles. And this is because, here again, in good Platonic fashion, the fundamental realities that we use to look at the world are beauty, truth, and goodness. So that
Hmm.
which is beautiful will be true, and that which is true will be good, and both good and beautiful. These are reciprocally kind of reinforcing things. So it actually makes sense in that context to then say which are the most beautiful triangles because they are the most true. If that connection holds, and so the idea that hopefully we're picking up here is that this concern for order is so essential to the entire project that then things that are disordered are necessarily problematic and at some point even evil. And the reason that this is, and Plato, I think, is actually more realistic about this than it might initially seem. So he doesn't like change. And what I mean by this is that change indicates a movement away from perfection, because perfection is necessarily unchanging. Or, sorry, let me say, perfection illustrates a dislike or a problem of, let me rephrase that one more time. Perfection is necessarily stable and doesn't have change because it is already perfect within itself. It does not need further articulation, and does not indeed benefit from anything greater because it is already great. So anything that changes is already less than perfection. And
Mm.
so this is true both in the cosmos, where when things change, they eventually return to a kind of equilibrium. And that equilibrium is most likely reflective of the higher reality, and in human beings, wherein emotion is changing. Now, this is really, really, I think, important because this is one reason why um, when people even today want to talk about God, this idea of divine immutability, unchangingness comes in. This is where it comes from. That is, that which is perfect has no need of change and indeed cannot change. And so things that are, and again, we do see this in the Christian tradition, we recognize this as well, that emotions are generally poor guides to behavior because they do not lead you to the truth. And Plato says that the wise person, going back to morals, is the person who oscillates between emotions and rationality, but that as that oscillation as you age and or get more wise, gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so that effectively the swings from rationality to irrationality via desire or the emotional life for the person who's wise is almost not there. And the reason that this will be important is this will be something that obviously Stoics are going to kind of harp on to some extent, and even Christians to some extent will also embrace fairly easily. That is, that which one feels is not necessarily true. And so I think this is one of those things that comes from the Timaeus that I think initially didn't understand was so basic to Plato's system. But as a result, we can also say with Plato, or rather, maybe I should say just that Plato thinks that this is where evil comes from. Evil comes when people are irrational and they do not obey the nature that minimizes the oscillations of desire and or irrationality. So in other words, you indulge these things and from there eventually become something less than human, and perhaps even evil. So this is maybe the third point, that if someone lives their life and they are fundamentally governed by their desires or some other kind of irrational force, then they become less than they were intended to be. And if their whole life is lived in that context, then when they die, they are reincarnated as something lower. So for Plato, this meant that if you live a life of irrationality, that is, that falls away from the perfect or the rational or the beautiful or the good, and you're a man, then you either are reincarnated as a less gifted man or, even worse, a woman, says Plato. If you then live a poor life as a woman, then you become an animal. And the fourth category that he talks about at the very conclusion of the Timaeus, is you become an aquatic creature. So he agrees with Jim Gaffigan that lobsters and shrimps are the bugs of the sea. And so it is a progressive system, and this is part of the reason why earlier in the podcast I asked you, Chris, about the ultimate destiny of the soul. Given that he thinks the immortality of the soul means that you remember from your past lives, because it's not only negative. If you, I mean, I don't really know if you could push it to this extreme, but if you're a good shrimp, like a really great shrimp, could you ascend to be a fish? Then could you ascend to be, a squirrel, and then a person, and then and it seems to reason that you could, and that way. That's an additional accounting of evil, that it's actually punishment / realization of the good. Now, what we think about maybe a whole other. So I think those are the three things you almost have to take away from the Timaeus. Number
So
one,
you're not
yeah.
saying that shrimp are bad people, are you? Like
Uh,
reincarnated? Maybe it's
I think that Plato, in response to that question, might put up the the hands, the shoulder shrug emoji. I mean, he might be like, I mean, I'm not going to say that, but everything, and maybe this is, I'm really glad you asked that. Actually, everything that exists has a soul. And what I mean by this, even that which is created in its entirety is, in Platonic terms, animate. It is because anima is soul in Latin.
sure.
The entire world has a soul, and this is where language of like a world soul comes into being. So shrimps do too. So it very well may be the case that a shrimp soul can return to a human soul, and vice versa. So
Oh, that's something to think about. So there is a kind of, I don't know, maybe a, a quality to creation that's more charged with a kind of supernatural, residue or something than what you get in an Aristotelian version of creation, which I do think is also picked up on. Christianity kind of picks and chooses from Plato's account of creation, and then also from Aristotle's accounts of creation and of the soul and so on, and then synthesizes that into a kind of biblically infused vision of what creation is or the nature of the world. I guess I keep going back there at how different and unusual this account of creation is, but then at the same time, how much is carried over into Christian thinking as well.
That's right. And I think there is one other point that the contrasting point that you brought up earlier, rightly, is the way this goes wrong and that infects the Christian church is Gnosticism, and the idea that the problem of the world, which I think is a logical outgrowth of the Timaeus, but that Plato himself doesn't really go for, is that creation is therefore bad, because if the perfect is uncreated, then and the goal is to return to look like that which is uncreated, then to escape creation is a good. And
Right.
Christian Gnosticism does precisely this by saying, effectively that well, yeah, that basically the demiurge is Yahweh from the Old Testament, and that there's a higher God, Abba, who is the God of Jesus, and that Jesus releases us from all of the created nonsense introduced in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is why Marcion of Pontus
Yeah, sure. Right.
wanted to
Yeah.
get rid of the Old Testament, um, and
And let's
you know,
but let's be real. Many people today would as well.
well,
And I think, yeah,
that's right. And
right.
one of my pet favorite philosophers, Simone Weil, famously argued something extremely similar to this, which hence the reason she was accused of being a Gnostic. And even to some extent in the arguments of people who say, "Oh yes, this is not real life. Real life is in heaven," or something like this.
Hmm.
And the created world is entirely diminished in that respect. So obviously, both a kind of Orthodox Christianity and a Christian Gnosticism can use Plato as an influence, and yet the ways they deploy Platonic philosophy are entirely different.
Here again, it's a very complicated story, right?
Yeah.
Because you see such a strong Platonic influence in Christianity, whether it comes to the early church and figures like Justin Martyr, or later in the works of Aquinas. Now, Aquinas, of course, is famously rooted in Aristotle's thinking, but he also drew heavily on Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a Neoplatonic mystic and a Christian mystic. I need to underline that as well. But you know, Dionysius was mixing or combining Neoplatonic mysticism and philosophy with Christianity. So you get this interesting kind of bouillabaisse of ideas.
Well,
And
as was
like you said,
Augustine. I mean, we haven't even mentioned Augustine, but I mean, this is the
100%. Right. Augustine, and I was going to say, but then you also have Irenaeus of Lyon in the early
right,
church saying,
right.
look, Christianity is not Gnostic. And he kind of roots it in a Jewish, right, sense of
Yes.
creation and the importance of the body. And so Christianity is its own thing. It kind of comes out the other end of these schools of thought as something very different. I think maybe in a certain way more confusing, but in another way more rich. I think because it does combine all of these just different systems of thinking. And
Well, and I mean, one of the most famous lines that Tertullian ever utters, what has Athens to do with
yes,
Jerusalem, is predicated on this
exactly.
very distinction. How much does, but yet to your point, you can't really tease them apart at this point. Christianity is simply too indebted to the Greeks to fully extricate it in I think a meaningful and helpful way. I think you can try, but it just doesn't. The tradition of the church is such that it has imbibed, and I don't think for bad either. I want to be very clear about that. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that there's a lot to suggest. I mean, again, Paul of Tarsus is clearly educated in Greek philosophy too. So it's not as though that it's entirely alien to even the most basic of Christian traditions. So
Yeah,
no,
I think Ratzinger's introduction to Christianity is pretty useful on this point. Pope Benedict XVI. I mean, they're different thinkers. I think understand that, and I hate to sound overly Hegelian about it, but that Christianity is something of a synthesis of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and then also, of course, Greek philosophy, and that
yeah,
these are all kind of together form something that's unique, which is Christian thinking, or Christian ideas, which
yeah,
have their own sort of way of shaping the world. And in some respects, I think the history of let's say philosophy since the time of Jesus is very much Christianity working through these different problems. And then in some respects, kind of almost we can see the West kind of pulling apart from Christian philosophy and arriving at something that actually is almost a kind of return to paganism. So it's like, so there's so much to explore here. And I apologize for keep pushing us off into this tangent, but it's where my mind keeps going as you're talking about this.
I think rightly so. Okay, as a key passage, just to jump in the categories real quick.
Yeah.
I think it's this. There's a nice little summary at the outset, not the exact outset, but pretty early on. He says, when the Father Creator saw that his creation had been set in motion and was alive, a gift to please the immortal gods, he was pleased, and in his joy he determined to make his creation resemble its model even more closely. Since this model was an ever-living being, he undertook to make this universe of ours the same as well, or as similar as it could be. But the being that served as the model was eternal, and was impossible for him to make this altogether an attribute of any created object. And then let me skip down. Nevertheless, he determined to make it a kind of moving likeness of eternity, and so in the very act of ordering the universe, he created a likeness of eternity, a likeness that progresses eternally through the sequence of numbers while eternity abides in oneness. And if you can't, end quote. So I think the amount of Platonic imagery that is in that neatly summarizes almost all the things that Plato values in his creation narrative between shapes, numbers, order, oneness, a lack of plurality, so unity and perfection, if I didn't say that.
Good. Okay, so then who would hate this book?
Aristotelians. I think anybody who likes like practical things finds this terrible, because it is, and it's hard. I mean, I will say this too. I'm not inclined to the mathematical inclinations of the Greeks, so my eyes begin to glaze over real quick when we start doing geometrical proofs of like. And there's a lot. Probably we stayed in the first and last 25% of the Timaeus, because the middle 50% is largely about the justification of astronomical orbits, because he does a lot of work on the stars and the ways that stars in their ellipses demonstrate blah blah blah. And I mean that's fairly. I mean, I would never assign that to a poor college student unless I just wanted them to never take classes from me again. So I would say, I don't know, that's hate, but no one's going to be, no, I don't think anybody's like, what, the middle Timaeus really rocks my boat, or something like that. So.
Right. Okay, good. Drink. What do you drink when
Well,
you're
man, you messed me up with that martini example. I would go with a wine. I think it's just very logical to imagine sitting at the academy outdoors or something, listening to Plato and sipping on a house wine or something. So I want to be very mundane and just be like, yeah, I think that's what I'd say it is. I don't think it's a beer. That's too Northern European for me. We need something, lighter, that's everyday, but yeah, I think that's
maybe
it. I think
maybe I'm conflating Greek culture with Italian culture too much, but what about like an espresso? Because you got to get through that geometry section too, like you said.
Oh my gosh, I don't know, that almost might give me like a heart attack, like drinking an espresso and trying to figure out the geometrical proof and not being able to figure it out. Just sitting there in abject aporia, and I don't know. That seems too intense for me. I need something to mellow out.
Right.
Okay,
And,
but
and we don't want to waste time here because
I know.
we know you only care about one thing,
That's
which
right.
is your
That's right.
your haiku. We should start taking votes on whose haiku is better. I might have you beat this week. What do you think?
No, you haven't even heard it, man. Just strap on your seatbelt.
Okay.
I'm kidding. I just want to talk some noise. Okay.
All right. Let's hear it.
Earth, wind, fire, water, shapes, order, and form cosmos. Demiurge designs.
Look, yours is better. I think from a
Yes.
formal standpoint.
Oh no. Okay. Right. Okay.
Mine's funnier though. I mean, yours is like really, sincere. It's sort of on the nose,
Well, I tried to give it some gravitas. I tried to give it some rhetorical flourish, but
right. Yours has more of a mystical kind of spiritual bent. Mine is done more ironically, but maybe that's to the point in some ways. I don't know. Well, that wraps up our discussion of Plato here on Just FYI Pod Ideas. Our Plato day, we started with the Republic. We wound up now with Clark discussing the Timaeus, and I think we've done at least a serviceable job of giving an intro to Plato, and of course, the best way to dig into Plato's works or to read them for yourself. Clark, do you have anything to add before we wrap this thing up?
Just like kindergarten, man, there's no better time. There's nothing better than a Play-Doh day.
Oh gosh, that's your second bad pun in this podcast.
If it's a bad pun, is it a good pun? I think that's the real question we have to ask ourselves, Chris. It's Aporia. Who knows?
That's a fair point, and you're really fully emerging into dad joke territory, Clark. I guess you're probably your kids say that about you a lot, huh?
They do. They cringe a lot and say I'm cringe, and so I've decided there's no use in fighting it. Let's just own it. Let's just lean in.
I think that's probably a good strategy. Okay, all right. Well, we enjoyed this discussion. We'll come back next time and discuss the number 5 text on our countdown of our list of our favorite works of philosophy. But until then, hope everybody stays happy and safe and digs into Plato.